Good morning, readers. It's delightful to be here. It's delightful to be anywhere. If you feel like I do, you come out of a long period of convalescence, and so suddenly there are people again. It's really pleasant. So I've written this book, The Plague Year, which is an account of the experience that we've all had with this pandemic. And yet, there are questions that remain, and I'm going to address those questions today. And I'm going to start with perhaps the most pressing, which is, why did America fail? I mean, the statistic that will probably resonate throughout history is that at the end of our first COVID year, America, with 4% of the world's population, suffered 20% of the COVID-19 fatalities. How did that happen? In October of 2019, just a month before the disease was first detected in Wuhan, in China, there was a global health preparedness index published, which ranked the nations of the world according to how well prepared they were for a possible pandemic. And number one, the best prepared nation in the world, was the United States of America. Number two was the United Kingdom. If the rankings had been turned upside down, it might have been a more accurate representation of what actually occurred, with countries like Vietnam and Latvia and Rwanda doing far better than some of the more industrial societies. So what happened? Well, there were plans. The Obama administration handed off to the incoming Trump administration what was called a Playbook for early response to high consequence emerging infectious disease threats and biological incidents. It's exactly what it sounds like, a manual to be pulled off the shelf when everything goes haywire. At the top of the list were respiratory viruses, influenzas, orthopox viruses such as smallpox, and coronaviruses. The manual told, which agency is responsible for hazardous waste. If this outbreak is a terrorist action, who do you call? How do you implement a quarantine? How can you evacuate large numbers of people? For an incoming administration with little idea of the scope of the federal government, it was an invaluable document. But the Trump administration jettisoned the Obama Playbook, and it conducted its own tabletop exercise, which lasted for months. It was called the Crimson Contagion. It involved numerous federal agencies, governors, hospitals, public health agencies, Red Cross. And if you read the scenario, it's spooky how prescient it was. Here's the scenario. A traveler returns home to Chicago from a trip to China. He's got a dry cough. The next day, his son goes to a rock concert. A disease begins to spread. There's no treatment. There's no vaccine. And 6 months later, 586,000 Americans are dead. Pretty close to the actual, a little bit of an underestimate of the actual number of Americans dead now. So what are the findings of the Trump administration Crimson Contagion? Well, they found that federal agencies actually didn't know who was in charge. That businesses were going to struggle when their employees were marooned at home and unable to come to the office. States were unprepared. They were relying on the federal government to shoulder the load. The national storehouse was severely depleted of ventilators, masks, syringes, gowns, everything you would need to treat a pandemic. There was a lack of manufacturing of these very items in the United States, and the supply chain would be choked up. Public health institutions were already hollowed out after decades of budget cutbacks. Tens of thousands of jobs had already been lost. Hospital capacity was severely diminished. And the longer the contagion went on, the more chaotic everything got. Robert Cadlick, who is the Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services in charge of preparedness and response, who led this exercise, told me that we knew before the movie started it was going to have a bad ending. But knowing that, the Trump administration did nothing to change the outcome. There were no lessons learned. We're marshaling the full power of the federal government, President Trump said on March 16th in a weekly call with the nation's 50 governors. We're backing you 100%. And then he explained what he really meant. We're backing you in terms of equipment and getting what you need, although respirators, ventilators, all the equipment, try getting it yourselves. It's much more direct. It took a moment for this to sink in. Governors just assumed that in the case of a natural disaster, such as a hurricane or an earthquake, the federal government would swoop in to help. The doors of the national stockpile would be thrown open and emergency supplies dispersed to the states. FEMA would swing into action. All the mighty resources of the most powerful country in the world would be put to use and brought to bear on the most dangerous pandemic in a century. But the governors realized on that telephone call that they were on their own. Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, told me that during that call she realized that hospitals in Detroit were already over capacity. They didn't even have enough PPE for the next shift. It wasn't a matter of weeks or months. They were out. Governors began bidding against each other for vital supplies from China. Andrew Cuomo said that it was like being on eBay. You would order 1 million masks from China, and then suddenly you're told, well, California just outbid you. Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, ordered 3 million masks from China. And when it arrived at the Port Authority in New York, it was seized by the federal authorities. So the next time that Charlie Baker ordered masks from China, he got the New England Patriots plane to fly to China. And when it flew back to Logan Airport, they hid it from the federal government. And this was true of governors all over the country. They were hiding their supplies. And rather than receiving supplies, they were hiding supplies from the federal government. Gina Raimondo, who was governor of Rhode Island, a small and not very influential state with the Trump administration, was begging FEMA to release supplies from the storehouse. And she was told that a truck would be on its way. And finally, she got a text from FEMA saying the truck is on its way. Tell me the time. I'll check on it myself, she said. And so finally, she got a text from FEMA saying the truck is arriving. And so she called her director of health and said, hallelujah, the truck has arrived. And the director of her health department said, Governor, it's an empty truck. They sent an empty truck. Another question that is still unresolved is, did China cause the COVID-19 pandemic either intentionally or accidentally? In December 2019, Dr. Ai Fin, who is the director of emergency services at the Wuhan Central Hospital, asked for a lab report for a patient who had an unrecognized pneumonia. There were several other patients in the hospital with similar symptoms, the pneumonia, cough, fever. And the lab report came back and said that the patient was suffering from SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome. SARS was a coronavirus that was an epidemic in China in 2002 and 2003. But the lab report was wrong. It wasn't SARS. It was another coronavirus. SARS-CoV-2, which I will call SARS-2 to distinguish it from the first SARS. SARS-1, we know, came from bats. They probably came from bats and then passed into an intermediate animal that was sold in a wet market in Guangdong. Wet market is where sometimes exotic animals such as beavers and alligators and snakes and raccoon dogs are sold and slaughtered in front of the customers, which is why the market is wet. That was the first epidemic since HIV/AIDS to be dangerous enough to threaten the entire world. Now, SARS-1 killed 10% of the people it infected. Compare that to COVID-19, which in the United States killed only 2%. And it took a tremendous public health effort to keep it from spreading. World health authorities went to China to see what was going on with this first SARS outbreak. And how did the Chinese behave? They reportedly hid the patients from the World Health Authorities, placing them in ambulances and taxis until the authorities had left town. And by that time, the disease had spread to Singapore, Hanoi, Ulaanbaatar, Hong Kong, Toronto, San Francisco. It was a lot of luck, in addition to that public health effort, that kept SARS-1 from becoming a pandemic. International health authorities were rewritten to take into account the Chinese lack of transparency. COVID-19 was the first test of China's responsibility since SARS-1. And how did the Chinese react this time? They smothered the news. They persecuted doctors such as Ai Fin, who warned her colleagues about this spreading contagion. They forced labs to surrender blood and tissue samples and shut down labs that were conducting genetic sequencing. They scoured the web and social media, eliminating references to pneumonia and illnesses in Wuhan. They ordered hospital staff to not wear masks because it might cause panic. It denied there was any human transmission at all. This even as frontline workers were falling ill, getting sick from their patients. On January 3rd, 2020, Dr. Robert Redfield, who was then the director of the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, called his counterpart in China, Dr. George Gao, who was head of China's CDC. There are, by the way, CDCs all over the world that are built on the original American model, which was then still thought of as the gold standard in public health. Dr. Gao assured Redfield that the disease was not transmissible. Redfield was suspicious. He said you should check the possible transmission within families. A few days later, they talked again. And this time, Dr. Gao burst into tears. He said, "We're already too late." Redfield said, "Let's send a team from CDC, epidemiologists, microbiologists, virologists to help out, and also to find out what's actually going on." Dr. Gao said he didn't have the authority to allow that Redfield would have to petition the Chinese government for permission to come. And Redfield did this on repeated occasions, but never got permission, nor, as far as I know, did any Western country get permission to go into China to find out what was going on in those early months. Now, suppose an American team had been allowed into China in January or early February. What would they have found? Certainly they would have found that it was a transmissible disease. All the doctors treating patients at that time knew that that was true, but they would have found something else that was vitally important. Most of the contagion was spread by people who weren't obviously ill. As much as 70% of the transmission in Wuhan was caused by people who had no symptoms at all. This was entirely different from SARS-1. and posed an immense challenge to public health. How do you recognize who's transmitting the disease? If it's flu, you get sick and you go to bed, and you know who's ill. With SARS-2, it was impossible to tell. And we didn't know that until March or early April. So, why do some scientists believe that COVID-19 was invented in a lab? After all, viruses emerge from animals all the time. SARS-1, as I said, came from bats. HIV came from chimpanzees. Nipah and Ebola probably from bats like SARS-1. SARS-1 we know came from horseshoe bats in these limestone caverns in southern China called Yunnan province. And in one of those caverns, there is a copper mine. And in the spring of 2012, 6 workers in that mine fell ill. Their job was sweeping up the droppings of the bats. And 3 of those miners died. A young intern who was watching the treatment said that the disease was acute and fierce, and an autopsy of the dead miners showed that it was caused by a SARS-like coronavirus. A team of scientists went down to investigate, and they were led by Xijing Li, who is one of the most famous scientists in China. She's known as China's Batwoman because of her pioneering work in cataloging coronaviruses in bats. And she took samples of blood and tissue from the miners and also went to the cavern and trapped bats. And she found thousands of samples, and they contained hundreds of coronaviruses within that bat population. Some of the bats had more than one coronavirus at a time. It's a characteristic of some viruses that they can infect the same host, and then when they collide, they reshuffle the genetic deck and create an entirely new virus. One of the reasons viruses are such a formidable adversary. One of the viruses that Xijing Li collected, she labeled RATG13. It would prove to be 96% similar to SARS-2. I mean, SARS-1 is only 86% similar to SARS-2. So that's a strong piece of evidence in favor of a natural origin. Perhaps COVID-19 traveled the same path as SARS-1, passing through an intermediate animal. With SARS-1, it was probably a palm civet. With MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, it started with Egyptian tomb bats and passed into camels in Saudi Arabia before it entered the human population. So why wouldn't it be the case of SARS-2 passing through an animal such as a pangolin, which is a scaly anteater sometimes found in those wet markets? Dr. Fauci believes this is exactly the scenario that led to the transmission from bats into humans. What's wrong with this scenario? Well, for one thing, Wuhan is 1,000 miles from those bat caves in Yunnan province. The disease arose probably in November, early winter, at a time when the bats would be hibernating. RATG13, the most similar virus found so far, is very likely not actually infectious to humans. There's no evidence that there were any animals infected with SARS-2 that were sold in that wet market in Wuhan, and no intermediate animal to date has been found. And then there's the genetic evidence to consider. SARS-1 left an evolutionary trail as it struggled to adapt to the human host. You can trace its evolution as new strains emerge. SARS-2 misses entirely that early stage of adaptation. It was, from the very beginning, highly adapted to the human host, right off the bat, so to speak. So this is why, since it was an amazingly successful human disease, Dr. Redfield believes it must have been created in a lab. Now, we could resolve this question if we could find patient zero, the first person to get the disease and successfully transmit it to another. Perhaps it was one of those miners in Yunnan province in the cavern, in the copper mine. His serum was frozen and taken to Xi Jingli's lab. Suppose a researcher took it out of the fridge and began to work with it. So perhaps that person got infected. Maybe he or she didn't even show any symptoms. That is a characteristic way that diseases sometimes leak out of labs. Now, lab leaks are far more common than people would like to think. Both CDC and Fort Detrick, the two most safest biomedical facilities we have, perhaps in the United States, have both suffered lab leaks. Ebola and Marburg, two of the most dangerous diseases we've ever faced, have leaked out of labs. Smallpox leaked out of labs in the UK on 3 occasions, infecting about 100 people. Several people died of smallpox. SARS-1, we know, leaked out of labs in China on at least 4 occasions. So it's not implausible that this leaked out of a lab in Wuhan. Another factor to consider is an experiment called gain of function. In 2012, Ron Fauchier, a distinguished virologist in the Netherlands, published a paper about an experiment that he did, a gain of function. He was working with H5N1, which is an avian influenza, found largely in poultry farms in Asia. And sometimes the poultry farmers get sick from their birds. And when that happens, 60% of them die. It's an amazingly fatal disease. Fauchier, when he was doing a gain of function test, a way that you might do it, you take the virus from the sick bird and you plant it in the nostrils of the ferret. And when the ferret gets sick, you take that virus and give it to another ferret, and so on down the line. Ferrets are used because humans and ferrets exchange diseases really commonly. So they provide a stand-in model for humans. Fauchier found it took only 3 passes for this incredibly dangerous influenza to become a probable human disease. It was alarming to people all over the world that something like this could be created or even would be created. Think how a terrorist might use such a thing. So Xi Jinping was doing similar experiments. She called them little infectivity experiments with coronaviruses in the lab. Typically, these are done in what is called a BSL-4 facility, biosafety level 4. It's the highest level of safety. It's where scientists move around in spacesuits and the air is negatively pressured so nothing can leak out. And even though there was a BSL-4 facility there, that's not where the infectivity experiments were done. They were done at level 3 or even level 2, which is sometimes described as the level of safety you would find in a dentist's office. Chinese social media nominated a researcher in Xi Jingli's lab as patient zero. And recently the U.S. intelligence reported that they suspected 3 researchers in that laboratory who had gone to the hospital in November of 2019 with COVID-19 symptoms. Now, the World Health Organization has twice sent teams to China to try to understand the origin of this virus. And on the second time, the team leader said that it was extremely unlikely that it leaked out of a lab, although little investigation was done to demonstrate that point, and the director of the World Health Organization disavowed his own team's report, saying that all hypotheses remain on the table. So will we ever know? I think under the current regime, we will only know if it's actually found in nature. And then we can say, well, yeah, that's the way it came. Otherwise, we won't know. If Chinese researchers created this virus in a lab and it accidentally escaped, it was merely a terrible mistake. But if the Chinese knew of this and covered it up, it's one of the great crimes of history. So another question that occurs: why are people so hesitant to take the vaccine? I mean, Pfizer and Moderna, by the way, they're the same vaccine. They differ only in the mRNA messenger that is used to deliver the vaccine. They're among the safest and most effective vaccines in history. The vaccine was created by Barney Graham and Jason McClellan at the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases. These guys got the genetic sequence on January 11th, 2020. 2 days later, they had the vaccine. 6 weeks later, Moderna has started human trials. When this disease came to America in early 2020, people were predicting that we wouldn't have a vaccine until the fall of this year. Can you imagine what our country would be like if we didn't have a vaccine? Well, you don't have to imagine. You just look at Brazil and India. I mean, with these highly contagious variants racing around, the country would be in total turmoil. So we have a lot to thank those fellows for. Now, vaccines can be dangerous. In 1955, more than 200,000 American children received a polio vaccine that had not been properly inactivated, and 40,000 of those children got polio. 200 of them were paralyzed. 10 of them died. I have a personal story from that era. One morning when I was 5 or 6 years old, I woke up and I couldn't get out of bed. I was paralyzed from the waist down. There was a time when it was common to see children in leg braces and wheelchairs, and we didn't see people in the iron lungs, but we sure heard about them. It was terrifying. Fortunately for me, it wasn't polio, and I recovered, and I still don't know to this day what it was. It was possibly an allergic reaction to a tetanus shot I'd had a few days before. Tetanus antitoxin is grown in horse serum. Horses turn out to be surprisingly important to the pharmaceutical industry. A lot of the great pharmaceutical companies began as horse farms. And perhaps I was allergic to the horse serum. Or perhaps it was Guillain-Barré, which is an autoimmune disorder. And it's sometimes associated with vaccines. For Zika, for instance, influenza, and just recently, Johnson & Johnson's COVID-19 vaccine. Influenzas are still one of the great killers of our era. In 2017-18, the flu season, 45 million Americans fell ill and 61,000 of them died. Fortunately, the influenza vaccines are extremely, but not entirely safe, and I've been advised not to take them. The worst influenza outbreak in the world was 1918-19 Spanish flu. It was so pervasive and so profound that it passed from the human population into pigs, which became a reservoir for this disease for the century that succeeded. And public health authorities were terrified that one day this flu, denominated H1N1, would return. And in 1976, it did. David Lewis, a young Army recruit at Fort Dix, New Jersey, collapsed and died following a forced march. He was 19 years old. He was a healthy young man. They did an autopsy to try to figure out what was going on. There was influenza on the camp, and But the influenza that David Lewis had didn't match any of the current strains, or even any of the historic human strains that CDC could find in their library. So Gary Noble, one of the researchers, compared it to animal strains. And he found in swine flu a match, H1N1, the same disease that in 1918 had killed between 50 and 100 million people. But in 1976, so far, it had only killed one. So how dangerous was this? David Sensor, the director of CDC at the time, told me he was starting a program to vaccinate every American. He said he was going to go whole hog. Then Gerald Ford, the president at the time, agreed with him. And I was living in Atlanta at the time, and so I got to know the CDC of that era. And I had never seen a government institution that I admired more. But I decided I would go out and investigate, since America was on the precipice of having this mass inoculation campaign. So I went to Fort Dix, and I talked to the environmental health officer, who was from Macon, Georgia, and since I was living in Atlanta, I had an idea how to talk to him. So I said, I had an interview with David Lewis's mother, who was a nurse, and he said, "Did she tell you about that pig?" "No, she didn't tell me about that pig." "What pig was that?" "Oh, some story about David running into a pig." Well, it might make a difference if David Lewis got the disease from a pig instead of a human being. So I got in touch with Peg Lapham, who was David Lewis's fiancée. They were a religious young couple. They were going to go on into the mission fields when David got out of the service. Peg was a nurse and a pilot, vibrant young woman. And she told me that they had been, over the Christmas holidays, they were going to drive from her home in Oneonta, New York, and upstate to his home in Massachusetts. And the snows had narrowed the roads down to a single lane. And as they were driving along, they came upon a pig in the middle of the road. It was a big pig. Peg said she thought it weighed about 200 pounds. And David had nudged it with the bumper, and the pig wouldn't move. So he got out and grabbed the pig by the ears. So did the pig cough in his face? Is that how this disease got transmitted? So I had to find the pig. Now, it actually wasn't that hard. We went from farmhouse to farmhouse, and a lot of people had seen the pig that season. And so we found the owner of the pig. He had heard that we were coming, and he was not happy to think that his pig might be responsible for the death of at least one person and the inoculation of hundreds of millions of Americans. And Peg, who was sitting on the couch, was saying she was still in mourning, and the guy who owned the pig, it was a house pig, said, "Honey, I know where you live. I know your family. You screw with my pig, I'll burn your house down." So welcome to epidemiology. Finally, I persuaded him to get his vet to draw a little blood and send it to Gary Noble at the CDC, and that pig had never been sick a day in its life. So the vaccination program went on. And it was inaugurated in October of 1976 at the Indiana State Fair in the middle of a presidential election. 48 million Americans got vaccinated. 532 of them got Guillain-Barré syndrome, and 25 of them died before the vaccination program was halted. And Gerald Ford lost the election. History might have been different if that pig had been sick. These are the stories that anti-vaxxers tell each other. Oh, by the way, H1N1 returned the next year in 1977 as a worldwide pandemic, and it was relatively mild. Only 700,000 people died of it. And it was thought by many researchers to be the result of a lab leak in the Soviet Union or China. As long as people are getting infected, new variants will arise. And it's a challenge to those of us who have been inoculated. The Delta variant, for instance, is 60% more contagious than the original strain that emerged from Wuhan. It seems to be breaking through immunity in Israel, for instance. I'm from Texas, and some of you Democrats know that the Texas representative fled the Capitol to go to Washington. On the private plane, 3 of them got COVID, and they were all fully inoculated. So, we're in a transition period, and it's because of the unvaccinated population who pose an existential threat to all of us. The only way to persuade them to get the shot is that the disease is far more dangerous than the vaccination. I mean, since December 20th last year and June last month, more than 5,000 people have died following a vaccination, but only 3 of those were attributed to the vaccination itself. Those were the Johnson & Johnson blood clot people. The only people now, there's 600,000 Americans dead from this disease, but the only people now who are dying are the unvaccinated. But they're also the only people who are spreading it. So finally, how will history judge this period? Assuming history pays much attention to it at all. Imagine if a foreign adversary had attacked America and killed 500,000 citizens. How would we react? I know how we would react. We'd be united. We'd strive to fight at any cost this foreign invader and sacrifice whatever we needed to do to save our nation. But that's not how we behave when the adversary is nature. The 1918 influenza, for instance, was essentially buried in human consciousness. It was overshadowed by the First World War, even though the flu killed more soldiers than the war did. The influenza in 1918 killed 675,000 Americans, a figure we're nearing now. The Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in American history, killed a little over 600,000 people. But history is written about human activity. So if history does pay any attention to this pandemic, I think it might look through it with 3 lenses. One is COVID-19 is an X-ray. It allows us to see into our country at all the broken places. And that allows or makes possible social change. If you look back at other pandemics, for instance, the Black Death in Italy in the 14th century, the pietistic Middle Ages, ruled by feudalism, at a time when medicine was built largely on astrology. At that time, the King of France asked his medical faculty at the University of Paris, what caused this disease, this plague? And he was told it was a triple conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Venus in the 40th degree of Aquarius, which occurred during March 20th, 1345. Something wasn't working. So that allowed people to open their minds, and fresh thinking came in, and that fresh thinking is what led to the Renaissance. I'm not predicting that we're going to have a Renaissance, but you can see societies reshaping themselves with new paradigms around government, science, work, family life, and our culture. Another lens I think that history might use is that COVID-19 was a harbinger. Deadlier and more contagious viruses await us. They're constantly arising from the natural world. I mean, just since the turn of the century, we've had SARS-1, SARS-2, Ebola, MERS, Nipah, West Nile, Zika. I mean, that's an incomplete list, but they're arising more frequently at a faster pace. Partly, I think, is because of the encroachment of humanity into areas where people rarely lived before, and also because of global climate change, which is forcing animals out of their natural sanctuaries. COVID-19 should be seen as a warning. Deadlier encounters are inevitable unless we heed the lessons that this pandemic is trying to teach us. And finally, I think that history might look back at this era and say, COVID-19 was a gift. It allowed humanity to protect itself against the plagues of the future. It guided us into creating stronger and more compassionate and resilient societies. It spurred the creation of vaccines and therapeutics that for diseases that we hadn't even imagined yet. I know all this may be a dream, but the alternative is a nightmare. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Larry. We've got time for questions. Microphones moving through the aisles, and just a note, they're being wiped down after each use. We are on top of it. Did you have a question up there? No?
There's one over here.
What's that? Oh, right here. Yes, thank you.
I want you to know I zipped through the end of October. It's so great.
Oh, thank you so much.
And
I did not pay this woman to be here.
I had to keep looking at the date of publishing because, tell me about that, about you started the novel before this whole thing, before the pandemic swept through?
Yeah, I did start the novel. Actually, this novel, the end of October, began as a screenplay for Ridley Scott that he never made. He had read the Cormac McCarthy novel, The Road, this post-apocalyptic novel about a father and son wandering through the ruins of civilization. And so Ridley's question to me, well, what happened? And so, because Cormac hadn't explained himself. And so I thought, well, what could cause civilization to collapse? And, nuclear war, but there are no heroes. And then I thought back about those days when I'd been at CDC, and those people I was so admiring of them. They were brilliant and courageous and humble, and they regarded their institution as a kind of spiritual place. So I thought, that's where my hero would come from. It's heartbreaking to see how that institution has stumbled. But I put the screenplay aside as Ridley made the mistake of going on to other movies. And then a few years ago, my wife Roberta and I were trekking through England. You can take those long walks, and we were walking down Pilgrim's Path, which is Chaucer's Pilgrims, all the way to Dover. And we often took lunches in churchyards, abandoned churches, or they're so beautiful, but nobody ever goes there. And so we'd eat in the cemeteries, and I noticed that there was a date that was common in all the cemeteries, 1918. And of course, England and UK suffered terribly in that war, but 1918 is a date that goes through cemeteries all over the world. It's like the iridium layer that marks the meteor that killed the dinosaurs, 1918. And I thought, I've got to go back to that story. And yes, it was weird and creepy that it came out in April 2020, in the middle of the first wave of the pandemic. And I was accused of exploiting the pandemic. This British presenter said, well, I suppose no one would pay any attention to this all if it weren't for this pandemic. It's a publishing plot to bring out a book when the bookstores are closed. But anyway, I love doing that. And the other thing about the end of October, I'll say, I was looking for a scientist who could help me create a plausible virus, something that would pass muster. And the man I found was Barney Graham. And I had no idea that he would become, this man deserves a Nobel Prize. But he's a 6'7" farm boy from Kansas. And he's, I think, the greatest immunologist of our time. And he helped me create the virus that's in the novel. And so when the actual virus came, just as he helped me cure the virus in the novel, he helped us cure the virus in real life. So thank you for that question.
There's a question up there, if there's a microphone. Sorry for the sanitation noise. I'm from New York. I don't even notice it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. On the brighter side...
I can't speak up a little.
Yeah, sorry.
Can you hear me now?
I'm going to come a little closer.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
On the brighter side, could you share with us more details of your perspective of how government and industry work together with regard to the unprecedented results of the vaccine being produced and available in an unusually short period of time, and whether or not you think this is going to have legs?
Okay, that's a great question, and it allows me to give credit to the Trump administration for the one thing that I would have to say it did right: Operation Warp Speed. Essentially, Operation Warp Speed was a decision to guarantee to pharmaceutical companies that they would be paid for their vaccines whether or not they were used. It's an unprecedented decision. And it enticed pharmaceutical companies to pile on and create many. There were nearly 300 vaccines still in development. This is an era where the whole vaccination program, the idea of immunology is transformed because of this, and especially mRNA vaccines. But what's often overlooked when we talk about mRNA, it is a wonderful way of delivering a vaccine. It's not the vaccine. What the vaccine is, in the case of coronavirus, you've seen the pictures of the virus look to me like a bouquet of chrysanthemums, but those little flowers on it are called spikes. And when it comes in connection with a human cell, that spike, I said it has an erection. It elongates, but when it does that, it kind of creates a sheath that protects the spike from the antibodies that the cells produce. So a new form of biology called structural biology, brought about by the fact that we have now the ability to see things at a microscopic level that we've never attained before. Using that kind of, you can actually, Jason McClellan showed me a picture of the spike protein. It looked to me like a sack of Cheetos. But you can imagine how the structure of the virus actually is. And using that, they were able to handicap the spike so that it didn't have an erection. And so they put that in your body, and and your cells then are alerted. Anything like this, stop it. And it's turned out to be incredibly effective, even against the Delta variant. People who may be inoculated and get sick so far haven't been severely sick. So I do think that this it's got legs, and that Operation Warp Speed was a signal moment.
Thanks. We started a little late, so we have time for two more questions. Over here, George, and then this gentleman here, and that'll be it.
That was great, Larry. And I'm looking at the map behind you, and
where are you?
George, over here.
Oh, hi, George.
Thank you for that. So the map behind you has countries that did well or relatively well in the pandemic: Vietnam, Rwanda, New Zealand, Norway. Countries that did disastrously: Brazil, the United States, China, which contained it after allowing it to travel around the world. What can we learn about which systems of government succeeded and which did not? Because it seems as if some authoritarian states contained it, some did not. Some democratic states contained it, some did not. Even within Europe, there were these wide discrepancies. Right. So what do we learn about what kind of system of government does best in in a pandemic?
George, that's a really interesting question, and the United States was ranked out of 100 countries. I think it was ranked 94th between Bolivia and Iran. And of course, when you look at China, we don't really know, how effective they're, but this total lockdown where you have 500 million people locked up, and forbidden, in some cases the doors to the apartment buildings were locked by authorities. That's one way of dealing with the disease. And you would think, well, autocrats have an advantage. But Taiwan also did very well. And it's a democratic society. It helps that their vice president is an epidemiologist. But they knew that this was a threat. They knew that they'd had previous experience with SARS. And I think previous experience is one of the telling indicators. In Africa, which had been, many countries in Africa had been doing very well until this latest variant, and the absence of vaccines. Almost the entire continent is totally unvaccinated. But those countries had been schooled by HIV and Ebola. They take public health seriously. I think in America, there was a smugness, a kind of hubris, where infectious diseases were concerned. That's in the past. We've solved that. And if we pose a challenge, we're the number one. We'll solve that problem really quickly. So arrogance played a role as well. As I said, we're going to face this again. So it'll be interesting to see if we've learned anything from this particular episode.
Great. Then this last question with this gentleman right here. Thank you. There's a microphone.
Once the virus was discovered in the United States.
Sorry, start that again.
Well, I'm sorry. Once the virus was discovered in the United States, what kind of response could the U.S. have made to avoid the death of 600,000 people?
What kind of response? What was the rest of that?
What kind of response could the U.S. have made to avoid the death of 600,000 people?
All right. So that's a really interesting question. What kind of response would have? Now, in my opinion, every country was bound to suffer. And the United States was bound to lose tens of thousands of people. But I don't think hundreds of thousands. Let's take the absence of a federal response is, as I've already outlined, it was one big thing. But for instance, masks. Hong Kong, which did very well during this pandemic, is the densest city in the world. And yet, the rate of infection was very low. Masks did that. Just a very simple thing like that. And what happened with masks? As I write in my book, The Plague Year, it was one individual in the White House, Matt Pottinger, who happened to have been a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in China during the first SARS epidemic. The U.S. intelligence community paid little attention to the pandemic. But Matt Pottinger, he was a deputy national security advisor, began calling sources in China. He spoke fluent Mandarin and asking them what was up. And he early on found it was a humanly transmissible disease. This before the public health authorities found out. He created a coronavirus task force. And he learned that from one of his sources in China, yes, hand washing, yes, social distancing, but if you want to put the brakes on this, you have to put people in masks. This was in March. This was before the huge wave in April. And so Matt began pressing for the use of masks. He was the first person to wear a mask in the White House. He said it was like wearing a clown nose. People gawked at him. The president asked if he was ill. And he said, no, I just don't want to be the first person in history to knock off a president with an infectious disease. And so finally, in April, they were able to get he was able to persuade the coronavirus task force, including Dr. Fauci and Redfield and all the people that you've heard about, and also the Treasury Secretary and the Chief of Staff, everybody on the force, that masks were essential. And they got the president to come to a coronavirus task force meeting and announce that masks, yes, they work. And so the president said, you know, I've been told this works, and that you should wear it, and it might be good. I'm not going to wear it, but it's voluntary. If you want to wear it, you should wear it, but I'm not going to wear it. And then he goes to a mask-making factory without a mask. Well, he turned into a saboteur. He undermined what was the last best chance to stop this spread of this virus. I could have told you also about the CDC tests, which delayed, you know, things for weeks, and you know, there were a lot of things along the way that kept us from containing the virus, and it was things that we did to ourselves. I hope that we learn in the future that there are ways of containing a virus as rapacious as this one proved to be.
Larry, thank you so much.